Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, Kate, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So my name is Katherine McCormick. I'm the co-director of City Energy Project at NRDC, and also on the line is my colleague and co-director Ryan Freed with IMT. And we'll talk a little bit, Katie, if we can go to the next slide. We're here to just talk about the structure of City Energy Project, how we shared out best practices over the last 5+ years of work and developed out resources based on things we learned and the network we built, so that other cities can hopefully take some of that and apply it in their own places. So we'll talk about first what is City Energy Project and how it benefits other cities, and then how your cities can actually use what we've done to advance your own energy efficiency efforts, with help from our City Energy Project resource library that we just launched in February. Next slide. Okay, awesome. So City Energy Project is a partnership in a lot of ways. We have three major funders: Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Kresge Foundation, and Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. It's a partnership between NRDC and the Institute for Market Transformation. And we work in 19 cities in one county all across the country, and they're very different cities, ranging from Los Angeles to Kansas City to New Orleans. They all have very different characters, different challenges. They're of different sizes. Their buildings look different. So it was a lot of what we were doing was trying to find the commonalities between them so they could really learn from each other and apply those lessons learned in their own particular ways in each of their environments. So the next, and the reason we focus on cities, and one of the reasons we work in the United States is that we have a problem with energy use in buildings. I think the latest
with different markets, what different messages
added up the energy use in U.S. buildings and treated them like their own country. They would only rank behind the U.S., China, and India in energy consumption. So by tackling energy use, energy consumption in buildings, we can actually make a really big difference in carbon emissions and all of the other benefits that come with energy efficiency. So we work in cities because mayors show leadership. They get things done. They work on the ground. Buildings are mostly in cities, and they're where innovation thrives. Just the pure density of people and institutions in the cities mean you get more collisions and more ideas, and they tend to be the progressive bulwarks of change.
And hi, everyone. This is Ryan Freed with the Institute for Market Transformation, Kate's co-director of the City Energy Project. The goals broadly for the City Energy Project were we wanted to create permanent energy efficiency retrofit markets in the cities that we're working in. The cities aimed for that. They were not looking for just one-shot 2 or 3 year efforts. They were hoping to create long-term successes in their communities where they could continue these benefits beyond the support that they were given from the City Energy Project. Obviously, they wanted to reduce energy consumption and grow their local economies. One of the big things that we, as the City Energy Project staff, were hoping to create was the development of new tools, standards, and stakeholder support for future adopters, and that would lay the groundwork for replication. And what we're here today to talk about is those last 2 goals. Through the first 2 goals, we were able to allow us to catalyze the development of these tools and then to allow other cities to use those through our City Energy Project Resource Center. So ultimately, what we did through the City Energy Project, other than work in 20 cities to pass policies and implement programs, was to really test out some approaches. What we wanted to do, we knew that we had a laboratory of 20 different cities where we could test out different approaches, knowing with different markets what different messages would resonate, and what different policy options were going to get us the deepest energy savings given certain circumstances and certain the ways that the markets were present in those communities. So if we have communities that have stronger retail markets, or if they have stronger Class B and C buildings, we were able to test out those approaches and see what was there. By doing it in 2 phases, we were able to replicate strategies from our first phase of 10 cities into our second phase to see if it was just a one-time fix that worked, or if it was something that would persist, if those efforts and lessons that we were learning were actually valuable enough to keep pushing in cities beyond the City Energy Project. Ultimately, what we want to do is enable adoption of these strategies and beyond the policies and programs that we were pushing through City Energy Project. There are more aggressive policies that we hope people would use these lessons to adopt beyond the 20 City Energy Project cities. We also wanted to build capacity. This wasn't just within the city. Obviously, part of our effort was to build capacity within the 20 cities, but we also wanted to work with a network of partners across the country who could start seeing how they could interact with cities and how they could be more helpful. So partners like USGBC, local chapters, were developing trainings and resources that are now being used across states and across chapters that are able to bring additional capacity to cities and states that wasn't happening prior to the City Energy Project. And finally, we wanted to make there be a new workforce of city-based energy efficiency visionaries. Through the City Energy Project, we hired 20 city advisors that were embedded within these cities that created not just new capacity, but an entire new focus for the cities. The vast majority of those cities kept those staff on, and it's highlighted the value of having energy efficiency specific staff for a city. So a staff person that is fully dedicated to the implementation of energy efficiency goals and priorities, of engaging the networks, of talking to the community, of talking to building owners, of dealing with the data, understanding what the data means and how it moves forward. The cities understand the value that that can have. So a lot of our resources focus on why it's important to have those full-time equivalent employees and the ways that you as city staffers can justify to the policymakers why you need the additional budget and what the benefit of that is and what the payoff is for that. So throughout the City Energy Project, what the cities achieved that led us to the position where we think we can say, here are the resources and how you can use their lessons. 15 of the 20 cities passed the building energy efficiency policies. We expect 4 more, so 19 of the 20 cities to have passed policies within the next couple of months. 11 of those policies have additional requirements beyond just benchmarking. So most of the cities have a benchmarking requirement. Over half of those cities have additional requirements that require something like audits or retrocommissioning or mandatory improvements of some sort. 16 of the cities made significant municipal building commitments, so they agreed to lead by example and make their municipal buildings showcases for how building owners can make deep energy savings in buildings. 18 instituted or expanded challenge programs, so they challenged their business community to take action to make deep reductions in their buildings, and then they engaged with them through other things. Ultimately, what we want to do is enable adoptions and benchmarking assistance programs. 13 expanded financing programs, so a lot of the cities enabled a PACE program. Some of them expanded more unique and interesting finance options. Boston was a city that implemented a fairly unique program to aggregate performance contracts together to get attractive financing for municipal buildings, which they're then expanding to in nonprofit and industrial sectors, and hopefully ultimately to the private commercial sector. There are 18 of the cities created workforce development programs, whether that was trainings through the Building Operator Certification Program or GPRO, or just trainings that they developed on their own. We've seen a lot of cities work with partners to create city-specific trainings that would be valuable for their facility owners to make it low cost, but to still put this information in front of the building operators, the folks who are literally turning the wrenches in the building. And then 14 cities enhanced their own enforcement of codes, of their existing codes for energy efficiency. So we know that cities have laws on the books that say buildings have to have a certain level of energy efficiency, and 14 of the cities that we worked with decided that they wanted to make sure they were doing that to the best level that they could. So we saw them move forward with code enforcement strategies. All of that is to say that the cities in the City Energy Project did a lot. As the City Energy Project staff, what we were able to do is to sit back and see what they were working on, provide them technical assistance through that, and then gather their lessons learned. We know that as you are the cities out there doing the work that it takes to serve the public, it's hard to take the moment to step back and kind of gather those lessons and then think about how you push other cities to do that and serve as that example. So we took on that effort of collecting all of the resources that cities were putting together and in their development of these hundreds of iterations of policies and programs across the 20 cities. The experiences of the cities in the City Energy Project were a wide range. So some of the cities were just coming together with the concept of what a building energy performance policy was. Some cities hadn't discussed energy efficiency before as a sustainability office or as a city. Other cities had gone pretty far in implementation of a policy and needed help figuring out how to best address the private sector and get them to understand the value of energy efficiency and to really adopt energy efficiency strategies in commercial buildings. Through this process, we created thousands of resources, graphics, reports, forms, templates, all sorts of things that the cities were creating. And on a case-by-case, city-by-city basis, these are all very customized for the local conditions. We were quite responsive to the cities and their needs in creating of these materials, but we also, where possible, would step back and templatize everything that we could so we could use it for from phase 1 to phase 2 cities, or once at the end of the project now, we can roll these out to other cities so you don't have to start from scratch. We distilled this at the end of the project and kind of went through and said, okay, what did it take for a city to get through this from the very beginning phase to the end of implementation? What does it take for a city to do building performance policy? So we categorized that into 4 general categories of work and decided that which resources we had that would be the most useful to cities. So the 4 general categories are understanding building energy use, prioritizing policies and programs, reaching community stakeholders, and then communicating progress and results. So if you go to our website, cityenergyproject.org, this is where the City Energy Project Resource Library lives, and you can broadly click through those 4 categories to get through all of the thousands of resources that we have available to you. Now, these resources are, some of them are very specific and created by the City Energy Project staff. Other resources are tools and how-to guides that can walk you through a process. There are templates, there are resources that are now, there's all sorts of different resources in here. Some of them original work, others links to others, great work that already existed. So we didn't want to create everything from scratch where we didn't have to. We wanted to make sure that we sent anyone who was coming to this website to the best materials. And we believe that if you're walking through a building performance policy, that this should help you get through this. So the next couple of slides, what we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation is what these different 4 categories represent used across to kind of wade through the resource library and understand where you are as a city and what pieces of this you would find useful to you. So we'll start jumping into the resource library specifically, and I do want to pause just a moment to say, please, if you have questions, type them in the questions window. We can, if it's possible, we can answer them as we go, but we're reserving quite a bit of time at the end for questions as well. But it's helpful if you can ask your questions ahead of time so we can start preparing our answers. So the first section is understanding building energy use. This section really provides just an overview of building energy use and why cities should find this valuable and what they should do with data there. So one of the things that we found was that cities loved the idea of a benchmarking and transparency policy because in theory, the policy is that you give people information about their building and then you put it in the market and the market will respond to it. One of the things that's important though, as practitioners of the energy efficiency world, is that it's not just a matter of hoping the market will take this information and do something with it, but the value that that information has to the city itself. In many of the cities that we've talked to, we found that policies that require energy audits, one of the most valuable things that the cities see is not an increase in energy efficiency from the buildings that have done energy audits, but rather more information that the city has about what the building stock contains. So to know what kind of heating systems they have, to know, what is the most pervasive system that's causing energy efficiency to be low, and cross-referencing a low Energy Star score with the systems that are in that building allows the city to customize that, the next incentive that they're going to create to then make real laser-focused improvements and incentives that can achieve real energy savings quickly, reducing free ridership, reducing the amount of time it takes to acquire new customers and new incentives and participation in programs. So this really helps cities understand the whole spectrum of why data is important and what they should consider from the beginning of this. It also provides an overview of utility data access challenges and tactics, and then some toolkits on how to use the data once it's collected. A couple of the more specific data examples and the tools in here that I think you'll find useful are guides on engaging with utilities. So we broke this into two guides. One was how cities can engage with utilities to implement energy performance policies, and the other is how utilities can support cities. This is, obviously it's strategic on behalf of a city to states that wasn't happening prior. Says, here's how you can help us. But really, we understood as we were getting into this that engaging with your utility is not something that most city staff do on a regular basis. And it's important for cities to understand how utilities can operate, what their abilities are, and then how they go about making their decisions. So engaging with utilities isn't easy, we know that, but we also know that the utility can often get in the way from things like offering access to data for the customers so they can benchmark their facilities, all the way to the development of incentive programs that are counter to, or at least not aligned with, the priorities that the city is pushing based on the information that they've collected. We've seen some great success with cities engaging with the utilities, though. Denver, Colorado invited the utility to participate on their task force in development of their policy, and this helped create more buy-in from Xcel Energy, and ultimately Xcel created in-house tools that helped customers access the data quickly and easily. They saw, not only did they see that the policy was coming and that they were going to have to respond to it one way or another, but they also saw that getting ahead of this and being ready once the policy was passed was a great way for the utility to provide a valuable customer service and ultimately achieve some of their own utility level goals for achieving energy efficiency and moving Xcel Energy off of fossil fuels. The other guide that talks about how utilities can support cities came from our understanding of interactions with utilities are at many different levels. So our interactions with utilities as cities with the regulatory team at a utility can often be confrontational, where the utility knows that when you're coming to them, you stand to prevent them from making money. You're trying to reduce the amount of energy that buildings are using, and they're trying to sell energy to buildings. So there's obviously a conflict there. A lot of utilities understand that and are developing energy incentive programs and trying to get ahead of that game. But there are things like attribution and how a utility gets credit for energy efficiency programs versus a city when there's a requirement. And it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. So the regulatory folks, regulatory staff at the utility can be a little bit more aggressive in their conversations with cities. On the other hand, there are utility staff that are dedicated specifically to working with customers, and the city is one of those. And these key account representatives know that by having higher customer support numbers, high customer satisfaction numbers, that ultimately helps the utility in achieving better financing and achieving more shareholders and just a more valuable utility overall. And certainly not having angry large customers is useful for them when they go to their utility commission, the regulatory commission. So this guide was created for the key accounts representatives, for them to come specifically and download, or for the city to hand to them. And it gives the account representative an overview of why the city might be coming to the utility. Because just as cities have a hard time understanding how the utilities operate, the utility staff often have a hard time understanding why cities do what they're doing. The idea of public service is somewhat second nature to us as we work in and with and for cities, but utilities don't have that same approach. They have different goals and perspectives. So this just tries to align how the city and the utility are thinking, so we can all understand the perspective. We hired 20 city advisors that conversation about that, but then ultimately see if we can align our goals and achieve them together. I'll kick this over to Kate for the next section.
Sure. So the work that we were doing as City Energy Project with these 19 cities in one county we were working with the cities to advance a package of policies and programs in energy efficiency. And this was tailored in each city to the different cities' needs and interests. I mean, Ryan mentioned the work they were doing in Boston, for instance. So there was a pretty wide variety of these policies and programs.
Were embedded within these cities
one policy in particular that we worked on with our cities, building performance policies, which really meant benchmarking and transparency as a baseline. And that's because if we don't have information about how much energy our buildings use, it's harder to correct that overuse of energy. So at a very basic level, we did work in every city on policy requiring the reporting of building performance scores and benchmarking to the city, and then the city making that information public to the market. Because we've been working, there were a few leading cities around the country before City Energy Project launched, and then in our experience in passing the policies in over a dozen cities, and then and working on the policies in all of our cities.
Hey, Kate, it's really hard to hear you.
Oh, really? Okay, is this any better?
Yes,
Much
thank
better,
you.
thanks.
Okay, sorry. I don't know. Okay, I'll just start where I was. So we really developed these. So we took all these lessons learned from all these cities we worked in and the cities that had kind of led the way in earlier years to develop a lot of guidance around how to put together these policies and how to make decisions about the policies. So we have a couple of guides in this section as well that City Energy Project authored based on the experiences in all of these cities, and they really offer lessons learned from all of these cities. We talk about how to engage the community, how to develop the inventory of buildings, so to really understand the building stock in your cities so that you can better design the policies and programs to reach those buildings. And then how to collect and manage that data over time, and what kinds of structures need to be in place, and what kind of staff commitment needs to be there in order to actually carry this work into the future. So we also include a lot of actual examples from cities, their notification letters, fact sheets, violation notifications. So we're just hoping that this is a screenshot from the inside of this implementation guide, and this is just like a general timeline, for instance, that a city can expect in trying to set.
The vast majority of those cities kept those
building performance policies. If you want to go to the next slide. Thank you. We also provide model ordinance language and a decision framework for adapting it to each individual city. The decision framework is actually very much an interactive kind of workbook. It breaks down the model ordinance language into, okay, what are the actual decisions that need to be made in your city? There's a lot of kind of standard language that can just be used across cities, but there are questions about, if you're a smaller city with a lot of mid-sized buildings kind of sprawled out, that's going to look different than a dense urban center with a lot of very large buildings. And maybe you don't need to cover as many buildings because you're getting after the really big ones and the most of the square footage in your city. So all of that is going to look different depending on your local context. And the decision framework really just walks you through what those different decision points are that you find in the model ordinance language, and provides some space to kind of collect notes from both the city's own preferences based on the city's goals, but then also indicates where stakeholder input will be incredibly valuable and should be recorded and considered as well. We also have easy to use checklists. We have fact sheets from individual cities that can provide examples. We've got guides for how to develop programs like challenge programs and the work done on financing and code assessments and methodology in that space. So it's a really rich, I think, trove of both guides developed by City Energy Project based on our experience in the City Energy Project participant cities, but then also actual examples from the cities on the ground that can prove as a kind of template potentially for those of you who are considering energy efficiency policies going forward. And then the third area of our website is reaching community stakeholders. We have a lot of different stakeholders in each of these very diverse cities, and that group, those stakeholders, there are some commonalities across the cities. They're going to look slightly different. The composition will be different in every city, but we do have a lot of guidance about how to engage the community that can range from large institutions like hospitals and universities to those environmental advocates and the private sector. And it's really critical to get that not only buy-in, but actual input in program and policy design and implementation to make sure these work as well as possible. And we do include templates for meeting invitations and agendas and notes. We have examples for like a scope. How do you engage a facilitator to lead some meetings, and why might you want to engage a facilitator? And do you want to have open public meetings with lots of people, or do you want to appoint a task force to tackle this and then have opportunities for the public to engage through comment periods and the like? So it just kind of provides an overview of the different options to engage community stakeholders, the different things to consider that we've learned throughout a lot of stakeholder engagement in a lot of places, and really offering even tips for the stakeholders themselves. So most of this website is very city focused, but there are also valuable resources on here for people who want to support and engage in the development and passage of these policies and programs, such as in preparing testimony and showing up to city council meetings, and speaking on behalf of energy efficiency efforts.
Thanks, Kate. And the last section is very similar. It's focused on communication, but this is focused on communicating the progress that the city has made and the results. So the idea of this section is that anyone in the city should be able to use the resources that are here. So it's not just something to say, hey, communication staff, there's this great website, go to it. The idea is that you, as the city staff, will find some valuable resources here. So it's tips on creating the websites, the fact sheets, the blogs, the press releases, all of those pieces that you need. And with the idea being, from what we found, is that if you, as the sustainability staff, the staffers working on the project, can go to your mix of talking to them with something in hand, saying this is what we want to create, this is what it looks like, then it reduces the amount of time that it takes to have that initial conversation about concept with the communication staff, and they certainly appreciate that you're ready to go and you know fully what you want to say and how to say it. It also has useful pieces in there about the tried and tested messages that work, that resonate with the stakeholders and the various stakeholders that you want to be talking to. There are some real-world examples with the fact sheets. There's infographics, and there are other tools in there from CEP cities. These particular pieces give us some understanding about how to prepare the communications materials, what kinds you might want to be creating, and then here you can see a couple of examples of what cities have done. So what we found that's important in this is that cities are great at getting down into the nitty-gritty and completing the work, but sometimes cities have a little bit of a struggle of telling everyone about what they've done in a way that resonates with the right audience. So if we're a very technical group of people and we've just done a very technical project, like implemented a benchmarking policy, and we get all these compliance numbers, then we want to tell everyone about the numbers and say, this is the number of kilowatt hours that we've saved and the number of kilowatt of demand that we've saved, and all of these great pieces of information that we as energy efficiency people find really interesting. But it turns out that not everyone in the market finds that to be interesting in that way. So what we've tried to do with this section is provide examples of how to talk to various audiences. We know that when you're talking to the general public to say, this is what your city has used your tax resources on, dealing with the data, understanding what messages to reorient toward the goals that the city, the mayor, that everyone has achieved, has committed to. When you're talking specifically to your stakeholders like the building owners, then it's a different message talking to them about how we've seen increases in rents or increases in asset value to buildings that have higher Energy Star scores. When you're talking to tenants, we want them to understand what the different health and other benefits are of choosing a space that has a higher Energy Star score that's going to be more valuable to them. So this helps you categorize what audience you're trying to talk to, and then gives you the right messages of how to talk to that specific audience. The idea is to make this much easier for cities to really distill the information that they want, so you can take your specific information, drop it in, and then be able to use the templates quickly without having to come up with your own pieces of information. Throughout the 20 cities and City Energy Project, the number of infographics that were created is quite large, and we know that that's a great way to share resources and information. So even if you can't just use one of the infographics that's available here as an example, what you can do is use it as kind of a guide to say, here is a good sense of what we're looking for. So if you're going out for an RFP or you're working with your in-house communication staff, they can use these as an example of messages that have resonated, and then build on that. So that is the 4 sections of the City Energy Project Resource Library. We hope that you can go to the resource library and find it quite easily and find everything that you need. Of course, we know that there may be some questions that you have now and as you move forward. So we're going to turn this over to some questions from all of you. We appreciate you listening to us until now, and now we want to hear from you. So if you have questions, please use the chat box, or there's a feature on GoToWebinar where you can raise your hand, and Katie here will unmute you so you can ask your questions. Are there any questions? Frankie, I think Katie has unmuted you if there was anything that you wanted to say as well.
Oh, thank you. Dave, thanks for that presentation. I think it's a really useful resource, library, and there's a huge range of information there. I mean, have you found, you highlighted some of the documents, have you found that any in particular are ones that are used more frequently by cities or have been most referred to, or what's been the sort of, or the area that they've required the most help on?
Yeah, so I think that from my perspective, the most used document so far is the Stakeholder Engagement Guide. So with the section that Kate was talking about in talking to your community. It's the idea that of reaching out directly and working collaboratively on building policies together with your community isn't something that a lot of sustainability departments are used to. Some have done a fantastic job and already have existing methods out to do this. Others have found this to be more of a struggle of understanding how to say what and to whom and when. So what the stakeholder guide provides very specific details, everything from how to arrange a task force to how many people you need to have staffing this and how many meetings you should have and the kinds of things you should prep for your meetings, like make sure you have food and those kinds of things. So very detailed resources in that sense of here's what is really useful for the cities. The other tool that I think is pretty valuable is the decision matrix that talks about how to choose a policy for your city and really walks the city through those questions. We know that when we work with cities one-on-one, that a lot of times they look at a leading city and they say, well, San Francisco is doing this and we want to be that cool too. So they run forward with something that a leading city has done. And that's great. We think that's spectacular when cities are learning from each other. But what we also know is that the process that a leading city has gone through to come up with their policy and approach was more than just sitting around a table and having a quick thought. They went through a rigorous process of trial and error and figuring out what would work and what wouldn't work for their community. So the decision matrix tries to distill that down for the prospective policy maker to say, here are the kinds of questions that you need to ask, and maybe you are being less ambitious than you could be, or maybe you think you're going to get more savings than you would because your market is slightly different than a different market or the market of the city that you're trying to model. So those two documents, I think, are the most used currently, but following this webinar with all of these wonderful cities running to the website and finding resources, I expect that to change.
I would add also that the city examples that are linked to in throughout the website, I think are also just really helpful. I mean, every city has, capacity constraints on actually pursuing this work. So seeing examples of messaging and information sharing from other cities can just prove to kind of reduce the barrier to entry to some of this work. So those are pretty valuable as well.
Okay, so we have a couple questions that have come in. One is, have you considered equity of policy impacts and how best that might be represented?
Yes.
So go ahead,
Brian,
Kate.
I don't know if you want to kick it off. I can contribute.
So we have, we know that as cities are jumping into this, one of the things that we hear pretty common is our mayor's top priority is equity. So that means something different for different cities, and it means something different for different cities for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because it's the mayor that hasn't been distilled entirely within the administration. Other times it's because the cities are having different equity issues, so they don't all have the same concerns and the same focus. But what we are encouraging cities to do is to think about those pieces in their work and where the impacts are going to have. So things like impacts on multifamily affordable housing, understanding where exemptions make sense and where incentive programs ought to be directed to overcome some of the challenges that you're forcing onto affordable families and affordable homes. So we've done that broadly. We've also done some more specific work in the cities of looking at energy burdens and other pieces like that. I'll turn that over to Kate because she did much of that work in the cities.
Yeah, so there's a lot of rich work already going on in the equity space when it comes to energy efficiency because of the myriad benefits that come with energy efficiency. In the work that we're doing, because it's based on getting data out there and getting deep retrofits in buildings, we do want to make sure that all communities do benefit from this work. And there's a lot of evidence out there that city residents and especially renters and low-income residents do spend a higher proportion of their income on energy than other communities. And there's an increasing trend also, at least for those of you who are US cities, in the utility regulation to also take that into account and really develop and design programs for low-income efficiency that really target those hard to reach communities and kind of get through barriers that weren't previously understood. So what's kind of an exciting opportunity here is in a lot of these cities that we've been working in and that have had these policies on the books for multiple years, we're starting to actually get data to really show that that these low performing buildings, these really energy inefficient buildings, tend to kind of cluster in certain neighborhoods. And this will actually provide some actual, some really consistent and good data to both to city government, to the people living in those buildings, who should know what more information about where they're going to live or work. And spend so many hours of their lives. And then it also provides information to those utility companies who are trying to target and trying to market their programs and get them actually adopted and get investments made in buildings. So there's a level of let's actually, there's a benefit, there's an equity benefit to getting this information in the marketplace. We just need to make sure the information gets where it needs to go and make sure that there are other programs in place, like utility programs, to support the actual investment in these buildings. So we've looked at the numbers in a couple of these early stage cities, or the cities that passed policy several years ago, where they do have this data, and it has become clear that the top performing buildings that have actually made improvements tend to be in those city centers And the buildings that are still lagging, where the benchmarking scores are staying pretty level, tend to be those lower performing buildings. And so just gathering that information helps us actually continue to innovate and continue to find solutions. And so that's like an outcome form of equity. We're also heavily focused on the process form of equity, where we just want to make sure that in the stakeholder process, and we do talk about this, I think, in the stakeholder guide, but we definitely talked about it a lot in the context of the stakeholder engagement in our cities. We want to make sure that the voices at the table are actually representative of the communities in the cities. And so building out that invite list for those task forces, or making sure you're marketing any kind of public meetings very broadly, and finding partners in the low income advocates, community consumer advocates, health advocates, thinking kind of widely about how best to reach these different communities. I mean, in Des Moines, Iowa, where they're currently going through the political process of passing the ordinance, they were able to get support from Iowa Interfaith Power and Light, which is a faith group that sees the benefits of climate action, but also it will be then good partners in implementation and making sure that churches, for instance, can actually benchmark their energy use. And so there's by including a lot of people and a lot of different stakeholders in the process itself, you can also affect the equity of outcomes.
Thanks, Kate. Another question that has come in is, do the tools make recommendations for programs and policies based on science-based greenhouse gas targets?
The payoff is for that. Great question. So the tools themselves don't lead you to, to understand the specific impact of your policies, but they are designed to help cities make decisions based on those greenhouse gas targets. So when we were implementing City Energy Project in the beginning, we worked with the cities by creating our own in-house kind of carbon calculator, saying this is what we think the impact of the policies are going to be, so cities could understand what the value would be of moving forward. And in the implementation of City Energy Project, developing policy decisions, making policy decisions, when cities were deciding, what the threshold of building size would be for who would be impacted by a policy, we would make some updates to our calculator to determine what the impact would be. So if you move your threshold from proposed 25,000 square feet to 35,000 square foot buildings, what impact does that have? And we'd be able to kind of give a very, very cursory understanding of what that is. Now, the carbon calculator is not a part of this resource library for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it was just kind of a back of the envelope approach for us to help cities understand what the general impact might be, but not something that we think cities should use as a sort of peer-reviewed effort of how much carbon was going to be saved. The other is that we know that a lot of cities have already done these carbon analyses. They've already done the survey to understand what their energy use is, what their carbon use is. And those are much more specific, and cities are using those to drive their climate action plans. So we want cities to use what they're already working with. But in the approach that we take to city policy action, we think that all of the work that the cities are doing should be modeled around the goals that the cities have committed to, and not kind of decoupled and looked at a policy piece that might have an impact on the climate action plan, but be separate from it. An example of this is in Denver, Colorado, when they were putting together their stakeholder group, their task force. As the task force would come up with recommendations or ideas or be discussing what the impact would be of certain decisions in the policy, the city was able to show them what the impact would be on the carbon reduction. So if the city is trying to achieve a certain percentage or certain level of carbon reduction through these policy efforts, making different exemptions or reducing your commitments in one way or another is going to have an impact on that. And by consistently showing that, Denver was able to really get the task force to understand the impact of the decisions that they were making, rather than it being just a conversation about policy design. It became a conversation constantly about what the outcome was going to be. And that outcome-focused conversation is always a better way to have bigger impacts within the policy, because what the city's achieved, that if they're coming together to achieve the goal that you've set, and they're not getting there, then they haven't succeeded as a member of that task force. For members of the real estate community, that makes them realize that either the city's going to come back with an additional policy to regulate them even more, or it makes people just understand that they committed to achieving a goal with the task force and they want to get there. So rather than getting mired in the minutia of policy language and what exemptions should read and what section 1.2 of the ordinance should say in it, people focus much more on the conversation about what are we trying to accomplish and how do we get there. So that's the approach that our guides lead cities to, is to start with your goal, always refer back to your goal, keep that in front of the community and let the community understand what you're trying to achieve. It's not you're trying to pass a policy, it's you're trying to pass a policy to reduce energy use in buildings. And those impacts are extremely important to keep in mind, because they also help city staff move off of a more an unintentional over-focus on passing a policy when it may not be the right approach after they get through the task force process. So we don't have any other questions, and I don't believe anyone has raised their hand at this point. So thank you very much for listening to the webinar. We appreciate your attendance. Our contact information is on the screen, and you can always feel free to reach out to us. You have our phone numbers and our email addresses. Please do go to cityenergyproject.org. Look at the resources there, and as you're diving through those, if you have more specific questions about resources, you can always reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. If you find the resources useful, we'd love to hear from you. If you think there's something lacking, we'd love to hear from you. We're always looking to, we think we can say, here are the better and more useful to cities. So please do not hesitate to contact us. Kate and I are here and happy to respond to your needs and your questions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Frankie, for organizing this for us. Thank you, C40. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.